Hi everyone, my name is Ella Blanche, and today I'm going to be talking about ADHD/ADD. The difference between ADHD and ADD. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and ADD stands for the same thing, except it excludes the H, hyperactivity. You'll notice that doctors and pediatricians and psychiatrists don't really use the term ADD anymore because they use ADHD as a blanket term, I guess you could say, as an umbrella term, and they divide ADHD into three types. There's inattentive type, the hyperactive/impulsive type, and then the combined type. The definition of ADHD itself, it's a chronic condition that entails attention difficulty, being hyperactive, being impulsive, as the name suggests, and it usually comes with low self-esteem, trouble with relationships, and concentration as a result of the parts of the brain that ADHD affects. And you can see this graphic right here that neatly presents the four of the parts of the brain that ADHD affects. If you want to pause the video and look at that, that's fine. The problem with ADHD is, ADHD naturally inhibits learning. It prevents effective learning. As the name suggests, ADHD comes with trouble learning, trouble concentrating, especially on things that a person with ADHD isn't interested in. They would have trouble concentrating in class. If they are the hyperactive/impulsive type or the combined type, they would be restless in class. They wouldn't be able to focus because of all the energy they have. ADHD also affects peer relationships, unfortunately. Those who are inattentive typically are more withdrawn, especially girls with ADHD. Studies show that girls with ADHD display more intrinsic symptoms. They're quiet, while boys are typically the louder ones that disrupt class. Many other concerns actually do come with ADHD. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children who are diagnosed with ADHD should be screened for other disorders and problems, because it's very common for people with ADHD to have other mental disorders as well. Behavior problems such as ODD, which I believe stands for oppositional defiant, when a child with ODD would act out persistently, display defiance towards authority figures such as teachers or parents. Another behavioral problem would be CD, which is conduct disorder, which is when a child with CD would violate serious rules and laws even. So, conduct disorder, it's kind of intuitive. Learning disorders, the most common type that most people have heard of dyslexia, which is difficulty reading. But there's also dysgraphia and dyscalculia. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Dyscalculia. Dysgraphia is trouble with writing, and dyscalculia is trouble with math, difficulty with math. And another thing that typically comes with ADHD, and one I do see exhibiting a lot, is anxiety and or depression. There's lots of different types of anxiety. The most common, I would say, is separation anxiety, which is when a child would be anxious or afraid of not being near their parents or their friends or family or anyone who they trust. Social anxiety, which kind of goes hand in hand with separation anxiety. It's the fear of going to school or work if you're an adult. Fear of going to places where there will be other people that they don't know. And general anxiety. just fear of the future and what it entails and what's going to happen, maybe fear of an upcoming test or schoolwork that you've procrastinated on, stuff like that. And then depression. Every kid goes through sadness and stuff. That's just every kid. But it does become a problem when it's perpetuating and it affects the kid's life daily. ADHD already sucks because a kid with ADHD would have trouble focusing on something that doesn't interest them. But depression can also further make that worse because it would be hard for them to focus on fun things that typically interest them. A common symptom of depression is being uninterested in things that are typically fun for people. Alright. Is ADHD present regionally, nationally, and globally? A similarity between all three of these lenses is that all of the accounts present a rise in ADHD cases. There's two main takeaways from this information. The more intuitive one would just be that more kids are being diagnosed with ADHD. As time goes on, more kids are getting ADHD. But at least what I think is that ADHD is becoming more widespread, more well-known. There's becoming less of a stigma behind it, I would say. More kids are getting tested, more parents are willing to accept that their kids has ADHD and would go out and test them, stuff like that. A difference between all three, specifically nationally and globally, is that ADHD is more recognized in the USA than any other nation, typically, just because of its roots and how widely studied it is and researched in the USA. And I know that other nations, specifically the UK, were a little bit hesitant about the whole idea of ADHD, because of the culture and societal norms, what is normal for a kid. Alright. The statistics. Regionally, in Texas, which is the region I chose, Texas, you can clearly see on the bottom left graph that it does present less cases in a percentage than the whole US. And that's actually kind of interesting. If you look at the national scale, which is the top right, states the highest ADHD rates, you'll notice that overall Midwestern states have higher rates of ADHD in a percentage than the eastern states and the southeastern states, which is interesting to ponder why that is. You could consider culture, religion, ethnicity, and the environment, maybe politics. There's lots of things that could change why that could affect how many kids are getting tested, and in general, how many kids have ADHD. And then globally, you'll see in the bottom right graph, or the bottom right pie chart, that 5.29% of the world has ADHD, or world kids. And I'm a little bit unsure about this, just because, like I've said before, ADHD is more central to the USA than any other nation, and you have to consider lesser fortunate countries who can't go and test people for ADHD. So I would not trust that percentage wholly. And lastly, how ADHD is treated. Since ADHD is a chronic disorder, it can't really be cured, but there are ways to go about and lessen the pain that comes from ADHD. The most popular types are therapy and medication. Therapy, there's many different types of therapy, obviously. Support group therapy, maybe one-on-one therapy, family therapy, cognitive behavioral, applied behavior analysis, lots of different type of therapies, and the studies have proven that it does lessen the symptoms of ADHD. Then medication. The most common medication for ADHD is stimulants. 70 to 80% of kids who have taken medicine for it have proven to have fewer symptoms. And there's also non-stimulants, which are a bit slower acting than stimulants, but they do last for about 24 hours, which is a bit longer than stimulants. In a way that everybody, because we can't really help with therapy and medication unless we're becoming therapists or pharmacists, I guess. A way that we could all help with ADHD is to lessen the stigma behind it. There is a bit of a stigma behind it, which is why some children may be excluded. ADHD typically is not very well known, and I think if people were to educate themselves upon it a bit more, maybe do some study and research in their own time, they would better understand that honestly, kids with ADHD, their brain just works differently. They process things differently, whether it be slower or maybe even faster. But they're not any less smart or any less able to do things than anybody else. They just need a bit more help and a bit more guidance. And I think that if people come together and they try and research and understand how their brain works when they have ADHD, then the stigma would be lessened, I think. And here are my citations. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you leave this presentation being more well informed on ADHD.